very dear friend to join us here. Kathy Bradbury has been at the Federal Reserve Bank since 1981. She got her PhD at MIT, having earned an undergraduate degree at Carleton College. She's been a friend of mine for almost all those years, along with her husband Phil, who's here, who teaches at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She's one of the finest labor economists in this country and has done some of the best research on income mobility of anyone I know. And we also share one thing in common, and that is a love of cycling. Kathy Bradbury.
Thank you, Barry. I guess I should start by providing the usual Fed disclaimer, which is that what I say tonight reflects my views, not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston or the Federal Reserve System. I don't think actually anything I'm going to say tonight the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston or the Federal Reserve System really has opinions on, since mobility is not one of the Fed focuses. But in any case, so what I'm hoping to do this evening is to summarize some key facts about there we go. Thanks. So I want to summarize for you some key facts about economic mobility in the United States. And by mobility, I mean how much families move up and down the income ladder relative to other families over time. The basic motivation for looking at mobility, I would say, is that cross-sectional inequality has risen dramatically in the United States over the last 30 years, as Barry just very cogently and in great detail described. This is true of individual earnings from work, and it's also true of family incomes. But some people argue that we don't need to worry about rising inequality because the US has so much mobility. That is, it's no problem that the poor are farther below the rich this year if everyone's income changes next year, so their positions are temporary. The poor will become rich next year or the year after, the rich poor. This argument would say that if we look at families' incomes over a longer period, there's not much difference in that long-term average between those we would label poor according to 1 year of income, which is the kinds of data that Barry was looking at, and those we would label rich in a single year. The income changes that people experience year to year, the income mobility that occurs, equalizes long-term incomes. But there are two serious problems with this argument. First, if mobility is relatively low, it doesn't go very far in equalizing long-term incomes. So the long-term distribution would be somewhat more equal than in any single year, but there would still be considerable differences among families in some longer-term lifetime measure of income. And second, we don't simply need a decent amount of mobility to offset inequality. We actually need increases in mobility to offset the increases in cross-sectional inequality that have occurred in the US. That's the only way that people's long-term or lifetime incomes wouldn't become more unequal as this cross-sectional inequality has risen. So I'll show you some data that shed light on the role of intra-generational mobility in long-term inequality in just a few minutes. The situation becomes even more problematic when we examine mobility across generations. That is how children fare economically when they grow up compared with their parents. One part of the American dream is equal opportunity. The children's future success shouldn't depend on how rich or poor their parents are. So I'll show you some analysis by the Pew Foundation's Economic Mobility Project that measure how far children move up or down the economic ladder in adulthood compared with their parents' positions on the ladder. And then I'm going to briefly touch on some research that investigates a key factor in the association between the income of parents and the later adult incomes of their children, which is education. Because analyzing mobility requires following individual families over time, much of the research on mobility in the United States, both inter- and intra-generational, is based on one data set, the panel study of income dynamics from the University of Michigan, which has been following 5,000 American families and their offspring families since 1968. When we're looking at intra-generational mobility, we follow individual families over some period of time. Most of what I'll show you follows families for about 10 years. or for 10 years, and we investigate the degree to which their family income positions change from year to year. It's possible to measure mobility in a really quite a variety of ways. There are papers out there that do all kinds of things. But one relatively simple approach starts by dividing the distribution of family income into fifths or quintiles, as Barry said, from the poorest to the richest at both the beginning and the end of the period, whatever your period of time is. Then mobility measures the degree to which families move up or down across the 5 groups between the beginning and the end of the period. So in this context, we'd say that mobility has increased, for example, if the fraction of families who start a period in the poorest group and end the period in some higher income group goes up, and similarly for families who start in the richest group and move down. I'm going to focus my comments on mobility for the poorest group because that's where our policy focus tends to be, but the charts also show the degree of downward mobility for those who start in the richest group. So this figure shows, shows you mobility measures like these for 3 sequential 10-year periods, the most recent of which is 1995 to 2005, that's the green. The 2 sets of bars to the left of the middle show the fraction of families who are in the poorest fifth of families in the first year of the period, 75, 85, or 95, who move up into any of the 4 other higher fifths by the last year of the period, 10 years later. And similarly for families who begin in the richest fifth and move down. So the first thing to note in this chart is that 40 to 50% of families who begin a period in the poorest or richest fifth move out by the end of that period 10 years later. So if half move out and half are stuck, is that a lot or a little mobility? One way to answer that question, I'd say, is to compare it with what would happen if where a family ended a period was unrelated to where they started. So people starting in the poorest fifth, for example, had an equal chance to reach any of the other quintiles by 10 years later, then the fraction moving out would be 80%, not this 40 to 50% that we actually observe. So I would say that these data represent only a modest amount of mobility, intra-generational mobility within a 10-year period. The second thing these data show is that those who moved up from the bottom or down from the top did not move very far, even if they were moving. Most stayed in the adjacent income group. So the 2 sets of bars to the right in this chart indicate that 15 to 20% of the poorest families made it to the middle or higher quintile, higher groups 10 years later. If families' ending position didn't depend on where they started, we'd expect that 60% of families would move that far, not just this 15 to 20% that the data say actually happened. The third thing to note here is that if we look across the periods that I'm reporting, mobility seems to have declined somewhat. For both the poor and the rich, the fraction moving out decreases a bit between the 75 to 85 period and the 95 to 2005 period. And on the right, the fraction who move beyond the adjacent group also decreased across the periods. The declines aren't big, but it seems pretty clear that mobility, at least if we're measuring it in this way, has not increased in recent decades, which is what we need to, if we wanted to offset the rise in inequality. So these data are taken from a research paper that I've written, but there are a number of other researchers who've done similar looking at the data and find more or less the same thing. That is, I think everyone agrees that mobility is not higher in recent years than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So I said at the outset that the key reason we're concerned about mobility is that the degree of mobility helps to determine how one-year inequality across families translates into longer-term inequality. And as I suggested, we'd be much less concerned with rising inequality over time if families moved up and down a lot from year to year, so they didn't spend long at the bottom or at the top. So next I'm going to look directly at what's happened to long-term income inequality. And for this purpose, I'm going to define the long-term as 10 years, which is certainly not a lifetime, but it is longer than a year or two. And I'm going to average each family's income over 10 years and look at the inequality of that distribution compared with the distribution of incomes in a single year within a 10-year period. So this figure shows you the Gini coefficient, which is a fairly widely used measure of inequality, and the basic thing is that it's higher when inequality is higher. On the left is the Gini coefficient of single-year income in each of 3 10-year periods, and on the right is the Gini coefficient of the distribution of 10-year average incomes. As I indicated arithmetic says that any changes in a family's income within a period makes the distribution of 10-year average income more equal than the distribution of incomes in any one year. And sure enough, the bars on the right are lower than the bars on the left. But more important, you can see that as the inequality of single-year incomes has risen over time, which is what we're seeing on the left there, so has the inequality of 10-year average incomes on the right. Whatever mobility there is, it has not offset the increase in cross-sectional inequality to prevent a corresponding rise in long-term inequality. So we can unpack these long-term inequality numbers to understand the year-to-year mobility patterns they reflect in a slightly different way from the mobility chart I showed you a slide ago. To do that, I line up all the families, again, from poorest to richest in terms of their long-term income, their 10-year average income, and then I group them into fifths on that long-term measure. So in this context, the poorest fifth consists of families whose 10-year average income, not just 1-year income, is low. And then I ask whether most families' 10-year average incomes reflect many year-to-year moves that are smoothed out by averaging the 10 years, or very few moves with single-year income changing very little from year to year. So for the poor, that question becomes whether the families who are in the long-term poorest group spend every year that we observe in that in the short-term poorest group. So what we find is that for the poorest and richest families, mobility measured in this way is really quite low. This slide shows you, so this is now immobility being measured here, by which I just mean that the higher are these bars, the less people move around. So the panel study, which as I said, I'm basing this analysis on, the panel study collects income data only every other year. So when I talk about the 10-year period from 1996 to 2006, the data only let me average 6 actual observations on income in that 10-year period. So we have 96, 98, 2000, 02, 04, 06. I'm trying to explain why this talks about 5 years and 6 years. So during the 96 to 06 period, and I've circled those bars just so that we can focus on them, 1/2, 51% is what's circled, of the families whose 10-year incomes were low were in the poorest fifth of the single-year distribution for every year or all but 1 year of the observations on their single-year income. The corresponding figure for the long-term richest group was 54%. Furthermore, families in the poorest or richest fifth of the long-term distribution who did move out of that corresponding fifth in the single-year distribution typically did not go very far. They didn't move out very far. Most have not moved beyond, in the case of the poorest group, have not moved beyond the second poorest group. Fully 97% of the long-term poorest group were in the single-year poorest or second poorest group, so in the bottom 2 groups, in at least 5 of the 6 observations during the 96 to 06 period. The corresponding figure for the richest group is a little lower, 93%. So this means that a minuscule 3% of the long-term poorest group were inside that single-year poorest or the second poorest group in at least 5 of the 6 observations during the 96 to 06 period. Whoops, sorry, just reread part of what I had put there before. So, but in any case, this minuscule 3% didn't get beyond the 40th percentile of income. They didn't even get into the middle in more than 1 of the 6 years that we observed. So the circled bars, as I said, refer to the 96 to 06 period, but if you compare with what you see in the non-circled bars, you can see that these patterns of stickiness have worsened somewhat over time. The immobility figures are slightly higher in the 96 to 06 period than earlier. The bottom line is that most of the long-term poor are stuck at the bottom. Most of the long-term rich have a strong grip on the top. And each of these 2 groups is somewhat more entrenched than the corresponding groups were 10 or 20 years ago. And I would argue that these growing gaps between rich and poor have consequences beyond the 10-year periods that we're looking here, that the data provides. Because research by many other people, which I'm about to summarize, indicates that the income situation in which children are raised has important implications for their own income prospects when they grow up. So it could matter a child spends his formative years in a family with consistently very low income, or occasionally the family sees better years and reduced stresses on that account. There's a recent paper that came out of the Urban Institute that reports that the prevalence of teen premarital birth, or the prevalence of failing to achieve a high school diploma, was 2 to 3 times higher among children who were persistently poor in childhood than among children who were poor at some point in childhood, but not persistently poor. And actually that, in turn, for those who were poor at some point, was 2 to 3 times higher than among never poor children. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk about intergenerational mobility. And to do this, I'm depending on some slides put together by the Stanford Center for the Study of Poverty and Inequality. They actually have a very substantial depth of slides posted on the web on a whole range of inequality-related topics, including mobility. So you can see the web address there if you're interested. So the key fact about intergenerational mobility that I hope you'll take away from what I say this evening is that people's family incomes are strongly associated with the incomes their parents had when they were growing up. The most recent and comprehensive research on this topic is done by various authors in connection with the Pew Foundation's Economic Mobility Project. Julia Isaacs and Isabel Sawhill are probably the most, have written the most on this topic through that project, but there are certainly many other authors as well. So they're starting with the same data set that I've been citing, the panel study of income dynamics. And they limit the sample to adults in the panel in the 2000s, across the period 2000 to 2006, who were children in families in the panel in the late 60s and early 70s. And they array people in the recent years from poorest to richest family income, group them into the fifths of the income distribution that they fall into, and they also categorize the 1970s parents by the fifth of the family income distribution that they fell into back then. And then they measure, just as I was talking about earlier, but now this is from one generation to the next, they measure the degree to which adult children were in a different family income quintile than their parents had been. And each bar in the chart here refers to a specific parent income group, that is bottom, middle, top, and breaks out where these children ended up as adults. So in the left bar, we can see that 42% of those who had parents in the poorest fifth were themselves in the poorest fifth about 30 years later. And only 6% of those poor children made it to the richest fifth as adults. On the right-hand bar, similarly, 39% of those who had rich parents ended up rich, and only 9% of those who were rich as children fell all the way to the poorest fifth as adults. The Economic Mobility Project actually recently updated their analysis through 2008, and they found very similar levels of immobility, with 43% stuck at the bottom, only 4% making it to the top 1/5 of those who started poor, and they have 40% of the rich became rich adults, and only 8% ended up at the bottom. So similar, although a little less mobility, including the more recent data. So there are 3 ways that we can judge whether the degree of intergenerational mobility researchers find in the US is low or high. As I did earlier, one way is to compare the facts with what we'd expect if children's income prospects did not depend at all on their parents' income. So then the expectation would be that only 20% of poor children would grow up to be poor, 20% would grow up to be rich. So that's fairly substantially different from the 42% of poor children who are stuck at the bottom, and the only 6% who make it to the top. A second way to judge mobility here in the US is to compare with other countries. This chart plots intergenerational mobility for advanced economies in Europe and Canada, and shows that only the UK among these countries has lower mobility than the US. Indeed, 4 of these countries, Canada, Finland, Norway, Denmark, have more than twice the mobility that we have here. So another way to judge if US mobility is high or low is to compare with our own history. The report that's summarized in this chart uses a different mobility measure. It's comparing sons with their parents. But it concludes that after rising between 1961 and 72, U.S. intergenerational mobility has been, quote, remarkably stable, unquote. And then there's another study by some Chicago Fed researchers using a somewhat different methodology, and they find that intergenerational mobility may have fallen, that is, these bars rise, after about 1980. I might mention that this slide is actually taken from the source that Barrett was citing earlier, that is the Economic Policy Institute's most recent State of Working America. Okay, so now I'd like to turn very briefly to the topic of how this happens, why children's adult outcomes depend so much on their parents' incomes. There's quite a lot of research indicating that a key factor in parent-to-child transmission of economic status is education. That is, children's success in school, how long they go to school, is strongly associated with parents' incomes. And educational attainment is strongly associated with earnings as adults. Sean Reardon, a researcher at Stanford, has analyzed historical data sets and shown that not only does academic achievement increase with parental socioeconomic status, but also that the relationship has become stronger over the last several decades. These charts show the difference in reading and math scores between rich children, parents at the 90th income percentile, and poor children, the 10th percentile. From the triangles and squares, et cetera, are from various studies that he has compiled on groups of children in various time periods, which is what's going along on the horizontal axis is the time periods. He summarizes his main findings by saying, quote, "The achievement gap between children from high and low income families is roughly 50% larger among children born in 2001 than among those born 25 years earlier." Reardon's paper is published in a volume edited by Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane, entitled Wither Opportunity, Rising Inequality, Schools, and Children's Life Chances, which came out last year. The book contains about 24 papers that are investigating a range of aspects of how growing inequality affects children's educational access, achievement, and attainment. One of the papers in the book looks at brain development and early skill development and how it can be hampered by the stresses of growing up in poverty. Perhaps not surprising, based on the neuroscience in that first paper, other research reported in the book documents that the income achievement gap that Reardon measures is actually already large when children arrive, when children enter kindergarten. Another paper looks at income-based differences in investments that parents make in supplemental educational activities for their children. There's a group of papers looking at neighborhood and labor market influences on children's school outcomes. One, for example, finds that job losses in a community, not for specific parents, but just in the community at large, are associated with poorer academic outcomes for kids in school, and the effects are stronger for low income and low achieving students. And of course, another key factor is unequal access to high quality K-12 schools. This occurs in part because of the local nature of school catchment zones within most school districts and the local nature of school districts themselves. Here in New England, largely cities and towns, combined with a fair amount of residential segregation by income, this localness has led to increased separation of rich and poor children across schools. And the gaps continue into post-secondary education. Duncan and Murnane report that the rich-poor gap in years of school completed has risen by about a year over the last 30 years. Another paper in the volume documents the degree to which low-income children are less likely to enroll in college and less likely to complete college once they're there than children with high-income parents. Differences in college enrollment and completion don't occur only because low-income children perform less well in grades K to 12. The outcomes differ by income, even controlling for test performance. So the study from which this chart is taken, which is actually not in the Duncan and Murnane book, finds that for low score, middle score, or high score children, college completion is higher for those with richer parents. And if you take a look at these two bars I've circled, low-income children with high test scores, that figure on the right, are slightly less likely to complete college than high-income children with low test scores. So even children in poor families who do very well in school are not as likely to obtain a BA as lower-performing high-income children are. Okay, I said at the start that I would try to present some facts on mobility. We were looking for increases in mobility to offset the rising U.S. inequality that Barry described. Instead, we found not very substantial amounts of intra-generational mobility, that is, moves up and down the income scale for families we observe over 10 years, and those levels were unchanged or perhaps declining between the 70s and the 2000s. So even long-term, multi-year family incomes have become more unequal. And other researchers, as I've pointed out to you, have documented limited intergenerational mobility. That is, a measurable dependence of individuals' adult incomes on the income positions of their parents when they were growing up. Like intergenerational mobility is not rising. In addition, it's lower in the United States than most other advanced nations. When Barry asked me to participate in this panel, I said I'd be happy to try and summarize the facts on U.S. mobility, but that I didn't know how to translate those facts into policy advice to our next president. And I'm hoping that those of you who participate in the discussion that follows the break can do some of that translating. I'll just quickly try to point towards some areas in which we might focus our search for policies to address mobility-related issues. First off, if we're concerned with equal opportunity, the facts about mobility that I presented imply that we need to be thinking about ways to loosen the links that tie a family's income next year and the year after to its income this year, and similarly, ways to loosen the constraints that limit the adult success of children growing up in poor families. So, for instance, this is sort of micro level, we would want to address the educational barriers that were identified in the Duncan and Renee book. But in addition, I think we also need to think more broadly about macro influences on mobility and inequality. And in particular, I would say one important way to address mobility-related problems in the U.S. economy is to undertake policies that reduce inequality. That is, mobility is much less important when there's not much difference in incomes between the rich and the poor. So as we think about the suggestions that develop out of the suspects that Barry identified, we can think of those things as also contributing to addressing some of these mobility related problems. And I guess I would like to point to perhaps two particular macro avenues that I hope people will talk about. One is that, for addressing inequality, that we want to really think about redistribution. I know that some people think that's a bad word, but that we want to use the tax and transfer system to reduce inequality directly, and also to reduce what people have identified as the existing concentrations of money and power that reinforce advantage. That is, so we want to make the tax system more progressive, we want to patch holes in the safety net, certainly. And then, I guess the second macro area to think about, and obviously these things I'm saying are not specific policies, but is to run the economy closer to full employment. High unemployment increases inequality because it tends to hit those on the bottom much more heavily than those higher up the income